There are moments in history where a society quietly changes course, not with sirens or speeches, but with silence, absence, and empty spaces where something vital used to exist. What you are about to hear is not a story about dating trends or cultural preferences, but about a nation slowly stepping away from itself. This is about choices, consequences, and what happens when one side of society decides it no longer needs the other. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what is happening in Japan today may be a preview of what many other countries are heading toward tomorrow. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. That support helps the channel grow and ensures these conversations continue reaching people who need to hear them. Also, check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and intelligently. And it is linked in the description of the video, so go check it out now and take control of your financial future. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support helps keep the content coming and keeps the lights on around here. Now let us talk about Japan, because what is happening there is not a rumor, it is not exaggeration, and it is not a fringe phenomenon. It is structural, cultural, and already deeply embedded into daily life. Japan is facing one of the most severe population declines in the modern world. And while governments and media often point to economics or work culture alone, there is another factor that is far more uncomfortable to discuss. Japanese men have largely stepped away from dating, relationships, marriage, and family formation, not because they are incapable or afraid, but because many have consciously decided that participation no longer makes sense. For decades, Japan has been described as a country of discipline, tradition, social order, and collective responsibility. It was once seen as a model of social cohesion, where men worked, women formed families, and the next generation was a given. That system had flaws, like all systems do, but it functioned in a way that ensured continuity. Today, that continuity is breaking down at a speed that few fully grasp. Birth rates have collapsed to historic lows. Entire towns go years without a single child being born. Schools close permanently because there are no students to teach. Neighborhoods are populated almost exclusively by the elderly, with no young families to replace them. What makes this situation different from economic recessions or temporary demographic dips is that there is no rebound in sight. This is not a cycle, it is a withdrawal. And at the center of that withdrawal is a large population of men who have opted out of romantic and familial life entirely. These men are not hiding. They are not confused. They are not waiting for better conditions. Many of them openly say they see no reason to participate in a system they believe no longer values them. And to understand how this happened, you have to step back and look at the last several decades of cultural messaging. Japanese society underwent significant changes regarding gender roles, expectations, and individual identity. Women were encouraged to pursue independence, autonomy, and self fulfillment, which on its own is not inherently negative. However, that cultural shift did not come with a balanced conversation about mutual dependence, cooperation, or the continued role of men in society. Instead, men were increasingly portrayed as unnecessary, outdated, or even burdensome. When a society repeatedly tells men that they are not needed, not wanted, or not respected, some men will attempt to adapt, some will protest, and many will simply walk away. In Japan, a large portion chose the latter. They did not riot, they did not revolt, they disengaged, they stopped dating, they stopped pursuing marriage, they stopped competing for roles they believed were no longer meaningful. And when questioned, many of them are remarkably calm about it. One of the most visible manifestations of this shift is the rise of what are often called herbivore men. This term refers to men who show little to no interest in romantic relationships, physical intimacy, or traditional partnership. These men are often mischaracterized as shy or socially awkward, but that is not accurate. Many of them are perfectly capable socially. Their defining trait is not fear, but indifference. They simply do not see relationships as worth the emotional, financial, or psychological cost. Rather than being met with curiosity or concern, these men are frequently mocked. They are portrayed as weak, immature, or defective. Japanese media has not been kind to them, and neither has much of the public discourse. Yet, despite that ridicule, the number of men choosing this path continues to grow. Mockery does not bring people back into a system they have already evaluated and rejected. At the same time, Japanese women have increasingly expressed that they do not need men for financial stability, social status, or personal fulfillment. Again, independence itself is not the issue. The issue arises when independence turns into dismissal and when mutual reliance is replaced by mutual suspicion or contempt. Relationships require incentive on both sides. When one side signals that the other is optional or replaceable, the response should not be surprising. Economic pressure compounds the problem. Japan's economy has struggled for decades. Wages have stagnated, taxes have increased, working hours remain long, often leaving little time or energy for social life. Many men work tirelessly just to maintain basic stability, with little sense that their effort will translate into long term security or appreciation. In such an environment, starting a family feels less like a dream and more like a liability. Social isolation has also become widespread. Friendships are harder to maintain. Community ties have weakened. For many men, work is the primary and sometimes only social interaction they have. When work offers no fulfillment beyond survival, and relationships are perceived as hostile or unrewarding, disengagement becomes a rational choice rather than an emotional reaction. The result is a society where intimacy is declining across the board. Marriage rates are at record lows. Dating participation continues to drop. The number of men reporting no interest in relationships continues to rise. And this is not limited to fringe groups or isolated regions. It is happening nationwide across socioeconomic classes and across age groups. The consequences are already visible. Japan's population is shrinking rapidly. Infrastructure built for a much larger population is becoming unsustainable. There are fewer workers to support social services, fewer caregivers for the elderly, fewer taxpayers to fund public systems. Entire rural regions are slowly emptying out. This is not abstract, it is happening in real time. In some areas, poverty has become more visible. Homelessness is rising. Young people struggle to see a future that includes stability, let alone family life. Some women, facing economic hardship and limited options, turn to survival strategies that reflect deeper systemic failure rather than individual choice. These outcomes are symptoms, not causes. What is striking is how often responsibility is deflected. Governments offer incentives for marriage and childbirth without addressing the underlying cultural and relational breakdown. Media narratives emphasize economic fixes while avoiding discussions about gender relations, respect, and mutual value. There is a reluctance to acknowledge that men walking away is not a temporary protest, but a long term adaptation to an environment they believe no longer serves them. When men stop investing in society, society eventually feels the absence, not immediately, but inevitably. Fewer families means fewer children. Fewer children means fewer future workers. Fewer workers means strained systems, and strained systems eventually collapse under their own weight. This is not speculation, it is demographic math. Japan is often treated as an outlier, a unique case shaped by its specific culture. That view is comforting because it allows other countries to ignore the warning, but the underlying dynamics are not unique. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Rising individualism, declining trust between genders, economic pressure, and the erosion of shared purpose are present in many modern societies. Japan is simply further along the path. This is why this conversation matters, not to assign blame in a simplistic way, but to understand cause and effect. When men feel they have no place, no appreciation, and no future in a society, they do not fight it. They leave it behind quietly. And when enough men do that, the consequences are not symbolic, they are structural. The most unsettling part is that many of these men are not unhappy. They have adapted to a smaller life, fewer expectations, fewer risks, less stress. From their perspective, opting out was a form of self preservation. That should concern anyone who believes healthy societies require cooperation, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. This is not about nostalgia for rigid roles or a return to the past. It is about recognizing that men and women are not adversaries and that societies cannot function when one side is treated as disposable. Respect is not optional, neither is contribution. When either disappears, decline follows. To really understand why this situation has become so entrenched in Japan, you have to look at how social contracts quietly dissolve. Social contracts are not laws written on paper, they are expectations. They are the unspoken agreements between people about effort, reward, respect, and responsibility. For generations, the social contract for Japanese men was clear. If you worked hard, contributed to society, followed the rules, and played your role, you would be respected, needed, and given a place within family and community. That contract no longer feels intact to many men. When that sense of purpose erodes, people do not immediately react. At first, they internalize it, they question themselves, they try harder, they work longer hours, they lower their expectations. Over time, however, something shifts. They stop believing that effort leads anywhere meaningful. At that point, disengagement is no longer an emotional decision, it becomes a logical one. Many Japanese men describe dating not as an opportunity for connection, but as a process filled with rejection, judgment, and imbalance. Expectations are perceived as high, while appreciation is perceived as low. Financial stability is often assumed, emotional labor is expected, and traditional responsibilities remain, even as traditional respect has faded. When men voice these concerns, they are often dismissed as weak or outdated rather than heard. The cultural narrative surrounding masculinity has also changed dramatically. Men are told to be sensitive, accommodating, and supportive, yet they are simultaneously criticized for not being confident and enough, assertive enough, or successful enough. This double bind creates paralysis. No matter what approach they take, it feels wrong. Over time, the simplest solution becomes stepping away entirely. In Japan, this withdrawal has been unusually orderly. Men did not form large movements or public protests, they simply stopped participating. Dating apps saw declining engagement. Marriage rates continued to fall. Fertility dropped further. These trends did not reverse because the underlying sentiment did not change. Incentives like cash bonuses for childbirth or matchmaking events failed because they addressed symptoms, not causes. One of the most revealing aspects of this phenomenon is how calmly it is discussed by the men involved. Interviews often reveal men who speak without bitterness or anger. They say things like, "It is not worth the effort, it does not make sense anymore," or they prefer a quiet life. This calm resignation is far more dangerous to a society than open conflict because it signals finality rather than protest. Meanwhile, women in Japan face their own pressures. Many are caught between rising living costs and limited economic mobility. The promise of independence often clashes with harsh economic reality. Some women delay marriage because they do not want traditional constraints. Others want partnership but struggle to find men willing to engage. The disconnect grows wider, not because either side is inherently hostile, but because trust has eroded. The media often frames this as a mismatch problem, suggesting that men and women simply cannot find each other. That framing is misleading. The issue is not logistics, it is motivation. When one side sees participation as a loss rather than a gain, no amount of matchmaking solves the problem. This dynamic has ripple effects beyond relationship. Consumer behavior changes, housing markets shift, industries built around families and children contract, entire economic sectors shrink, schools close, childcare centers shut down, communities lose their vibrancy. What replaces it is often silence and age. Japan's aging population is one of the most visible outcomes of this trend. With fewer young people and more elderly citizens, the burden on social systems grows heavier each year. Care facilities are understaffed, pension systems strain, taxes rise to compensate. Younger workers shoulder increasing responsibility without seeing proportional benefit. This further discourages family formation, creating a feedback loop that is difficult to escape. The emotional toll of this environment is subtle but significant. Loneliness becomes normalized. Isolation is no longer seen as a problem to be solved, but as a lifestyle choice. While some individuals genuinely prefer solitude, widespread isolation is not a sign of healthy social evolution. It is often a response to repeated disappointment. In Japan, technology has partially filled the void. Entertainment, virtual spaces, and digital communities provide distraction and stimulation without the risks of real world relationships. For many men, these outlets offer control and predictability that human relationships no longer do. This is not a cause of withdrawal, but a coping mechanism that reinforces it. The concept of legacy also shifts in this environment. When men do not expect to have families, their time horizon shortens. Long term investment in society feels abstract. Why sacrifice today for a future that does not include you? This mindset quietly undermines civic engagement, volunteerism, and collective responsibility. Governments struggle to respond because the problem resists traditional policy tools. You cannot legislate desire. You cannot mandate trust. You cannot force people to form families. Cultural repair requires honesty, humility, and dialogue, all of which are difficult in environments where blame is politically safer than reflection. There is also a reluctance to acknowledge male disengagement as a legitimate issue. Discussions often focus on women's challenges, which are real and important, while men's withdrawal is framed as immaturity or failure. This imbalance prevents constructive solutions. You cannot fix a problem you refuse to name accurately. What makes Japan's case especially important is its visibility. The effects are no longer theoretical, they are measurable. Population decline is accelerating. Economic growth is constrained. Labor shortages are widespread. Automation fills some gaps, but not all. Robots cannot replace human care, human connection, or human continuity. International observers often express concern, but few draw the deeper lesson. Japan is not collapsing because men are lazy or women are independent. It is declining because cooperation has broken down. Societies are not sustained by individual success alone. They require mutual investment. When that investment dries up, the system weakens. The idea that almost an entire generation of men would simply opt out of dating and marriage would have seemed unthinkable a few decades ago. Today, It is reality. And it did not happen overnight. It happened gradually through countless small interactions that left people feeling undervalued, unheard, or unnecessary. This is why simplistic explanations fail. You cannot reduce this to economics alone, nor to culture alone. It is an accumulation of factors that together create an environment where disengagement feels reasonable. When enough people reach that conclusion independently, the outcome becomes collective. One of the most uncomfortable truths is that many men believe society will not change, regardless of their participation. From their perspective, opting out does not harm a system that already disregards them. This belief may or may not be accurate, but it is deeply held, and beliefs shape behavior. As this mindset spreads, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. Younger men grow up observing older men who are disengaged. They internalize the idea that relationships are optional or undesirable. Expectations adjust downward from the beginning. By the time policymakers notice, the cultural shift is already embedded. Japan's experience challenges the assumption that social progress automatically leads to better outcomes. Progress without balance can destabilize as much as stagnation. When change prioritizes individual autonomy without reinforcing shared responsibility, cohesion suffers. This is not an argument against women's rights or personal freedom. It is an argument for recognizing that rights without relationships do not sustain societies. Independence does not eliminate interdependence. Men and women still rely on each other, whether acknowledged or not. As we move forward in this discussion, it becomes essential to ask harder questions. What does respect look like in a modern society? How do men and women rebuild trust after years of mutual withdrawal? What incentives actually matter when emotional and social costs feel too high? Japan is a case study, not a verdict. It shows what happens when disengagement becomes normalized. It shows how quickly demographics respond to cultural shifts. And it shows that once men walk away, calling them back is not as simple as offering benefits or issuing appeals. The silence in Japan's empty towns is not accidental. It is the sound of a social contract dissolving. And that sound should be taken seriously by anyone paying attention. When people outside Japan hear about this situation, the instinctive response is often disbelief. They assume there must be some hidden exaggeration or that the issue is being overstated for dramatic effect. But inside Japan, the reality is visible in daily life. You can see it in the empty playgrounds, the shuttered schools, the quiet neighborhoods where laughter once echoed. You can see it in the workforce shortages, the aging faces behind store counters, and the increasing number of services quietly scaling back because there are not enough people to sustain them. What is often missed in external analysis is that this is not just a demographic crisis, it is a meaning crisis. People do not stop forming families simply because life is hard. Humans have endured hardship for all of history. They stop forming families when the future feels disconnected from their effort. When sacrifice no longer feels noble or necessary, continuity breaks. Japanese men did not wake up one day and collectively decide to abandon relationships. This was the outcome of years of subtle signals. Signals that said, your role is unclear. Your contribution is undervalued. Your presence is optional. Over time, those messages accumulate and reshape identity. When men no longer see themselves as builders of the future, they stop building. The language used around men matters more than many want to admit. Public discourse that consistently frames men as problems to be managed rather than partners to be valued has consequences. Even when the intent is reform or progress, the tone can alienate those it seeks to reshape. In Japan, many men internalized the idea that they were either obstacles or afterthoughts in a society moving on without them. This internalization shows up in how men talk about themselves. They describe feeling invisible, Not hated, not attacked, just unseen. And invisibility is corrosive. People can endure criticism more easily than indifference. When no one seems to care whether you show up or not, eventually you stop showing up. Women, too, are affected by this erosion of connection. Many Japanese women express frustration at the lack of available partners who are willing to commit. They describe a dating environment where men appear disengaged, emotionally distant, or uninterested. What often goes unexamined is how this disengagement is itself a response to long-standing conditions. It is not apathy born from comfort. It is apathy born from repeated disappointment. And this creates a tragic feedback loop. Women perceive men as withdrawn and unmotivated. Men perceive women as dismissive and demanding. Each side uses the behavior of the other as confirmation of their worst assumptions. Over time, trust erodes completely. When trust disappears, desire follows, and the economic backdrop intensifies everything. Japan's long period of low growth has reshaped expectations. Younger generations do not expect rapid advancement or financial security. Many men believe that even if they work hard, they will struggle to provide stability for a family. When providing is no longer realistic, the traditional incentive to form one weakens. At the same time, social expectations have not fully adjusted to economic reality. Men are still often judged by standards set in a more prosperous era. The gap between expectation and possibility creates shame and anxiety. Rather than confront those feelings publicly, many men choose withdrawal as a form of emotional self defense. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted as laziness or lack of ambition. In reality, many disengaged men continue to work diligently. They simply limit their investment to survival rather than growth. They meet their obligations, but they do not go beyond them. The future feels too uncertain to justify deeper commitment. The concept of masculinity itself has become fragmented. Traditional models are criticized as outdated, while newer models remain poorly defined. Men are told what not to be, but rarely shown what they should become. In the absence of a coherent narrative, many opt out of the conversation entirely. Japan's collectivist culture once provided a strong sense of belonging. Today, that collective identity feels fractured. Individual success is emphasized, but individual struggle is often borne alone. When people feel isolated in their challenges, solidarity weakens. Technology plays a dual role in this environment. On one hand, it offers connection, entertainment, and escape. On the other hand, it reduces the urgency of real world relationships. Virtual fulfillment is easier, safer, and more predictable. For men already skeptical of romantic engagement, digital alternatives reinforce disengagement. This does not mean technology caused the problem. It simply filled a vacuum created by declining trust and rising dissatisfaction. When real world relationships feel high risk and low reward, people naturally gravitate toward environments where effort and outcome are more directly linked. Japan's response to this crisis has been cautious and fragmented. Policymakers introduce incentives, campaigns, and programs, but avoid deeper cultural introspection. It is easier to offer subsidies than to address resentment. It is easier to promote marriage than to rebuild mutual respect. The reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths delays meaningful change. Acknowledging that men feel alienated does not diminish women's struggles. Both can be true at the same time. But when discourse becomes a competition over who suffers more, solutions become impossible. One of the most sobering aspects of Japan's situation is how normalized it has become. Young people grow up assuming low marriage rates and childlessness are standard. Empty classrooms feel ordinary. Elder dominated communities feel inevitable. When decline becomes normal, urgency disappears. This normalization spreads across generations. Children raised in smaller social circles develop different expectations about community and family. Without exposure to vibrant multi generational life, their imagination of the future narrows. What once felt abnormal becomes accepted. The psychological impact of this shift is difficult to quantify, but deeply real. Societies draw strength from continuity. When that continuity weakens, existential uncertainty rises. People begin to question the point of effort beyond personal comfort. In this environment, calls for national revival or demographic renewal ring hollow. They feel abstract and disconnected from lived experience. People cannot be motivated by slogans when their daily reality offers little reason to hope. Japan's experience also challenges the assumption that modernization automatically leads to happier societies. Material comfort does not compensate for relational breakdown. Economic stability cannot replace meaning. When people feel disconnected from one another, prosperity loses its power. International comparisons often focus on birth rates and marriage statistics, but numbers alone do not tell the full story. Behind each statistic is a personal decision shaped by emotion, perception, and experience. When millions of individuals independently decide that opting out is rational, the result is collective decline. This is why blaming any single group misses the point. The issue is systemic. It emerges from interactions, narratives, and incentives that evolved over time. Assigning moral judgment may feel satisfying, but it does not reverse disengagement. The silence of Japan's declining towns is not loud enough to provoke outrage, but it is persistent enough to demand attention. Each year, without change, deepens the problem. Each generation raised within this environment inherits its limitations. What makes this especially relevant beyond Japan is that similar patterns are appearing elsewhere. Declining birth rates, rising male disengagement, growing distrust between genders, economic pressure paired with cultural confusion. These are not isolated phenomena. Japan simply reached the tipping point first. Its experience offers a glimpse into a future many societies may face if they continue down the same path. Ignoring that lesson does not make it disappear. As we continue, it becomes necessary to examine why attempts to reverse these trends often fail, and why appealing to duty or patriotism is ineffective when people feel emotionally disconnected. Because until the underlying sense of alienation is addressed, no amount of policy intervention will restore participation. The question is not whether societies can survive without engaged men. The question is how long they can pretend they can. And the answer, as Japan demonstrates, is not very long. When you step back and examine the broader global landscape, what is happening in Japan no longer feels isolated or strange. It begins to look like an early chapter in a much larger story. Across many developed nations, similar patterns are emerging, sometimes slower, sometimes disguised, but moving in the same direction. Birth rates are falling. Marriage is being delayed or abandoned. Men are disengaging not only from relationships, but from civic life, ambition, and long term planning. Japan is not an exception, it is a warning. One of the biggest mistakes societies make is assuming that human behavior will always align with policy goals. Governments can adjust tax codes, offer incentives, or run public campaigns, but none of those tools can manufacture desire or rebuild trust. When people feel alienated, they do not respond to encouragement. They respond to conditions. And if conditions do not change, behavior does not either. In many Western countries, the conversation around declining birth rates is framed almost entirely around economics. Housing costs, childcare expenses, student debt, and job insecurity are cited as the primary reasons people delay or avoid family formation. These factors matter, but they are incomplete explanations. If economics alone determined birth rates, history would look very different. People form families in far harsher conditions than most face today. What has changed is not just affordability, but perception. The perceived return on emotional investment has declined. For many men, the risk associated with relationships feels high, while the reward feels uncertain or temporary. When that perception becomes widespread, participation drops regardless of material conditions. Japan shows what happens when this mindset becomes entrenched. Men stop seeing relationships as pathways to meaning and start viewing them as liabilities. Once that shift occurs, reversing it requires more than incentives. It requires rebuilding a sense of mutual respect that cannot be imposed from above. Another critical factor is narrative. Societies run on stories, stories about who matters, who contributes, and who is valued. When public narratives consistently emphasize certain voices while minimizing others, imbalance grows. In Japan, many men felt their struggles were invisible, their sacrifices unacknowledged, and their concerns dismissed. Over time, silence replaced dialogue. This pattern is repeating elsewhere. Men in various countries report feeling blamed for systemic issues they did not create, judged by standards they cannot meet, and excluded from conversations about the future. Whether those perceptions are fully accurate is almost irrelevant. What matters is that they are believed, and beliefs shape behavior. One of the most dangerous assumptions is that disengaged men can simply be replaced. Some argue that automation, migration, or policy reform can compensate for declining participation. These solutions may address labor shortages temporarily, but they do not replace social cohesion. Societies are not machines. They require buy in, loyalty, and emotional investment. Japan's experience demonstrates that when men withdraw, the effects ripple outward. Fewer relationships lead to fewer families. Fewer families lead to fewer children. Fewer children lead to fewer future workers. Over time, this weakens everything from infrastructure to cultural continuity. There is no quick fix for this kind of decline. The emotional cost of disengagement is often underestimated. While some men adapt to solitude, many experience quiet despair. Loneliness becomes normalized, but normalization does not equal health. Social isolation erodes mental resilience and weakens community bonds. When isolation spreads, collective identity dissolves. Japan's collectivist roots once mitigated these effects, but even that foundation has eroded under sustained pressure. When collective responsibility is replaced by individual survival, trust collapses. People stop believing that their effort contributes to something larger than themselves. This loss of shared purpose is perhaps the most critical element of the crisis. Humans are driven by meaning as much as by comfort. When meaning disappears, motivation follows. Men who do not see a future worth building will not build one. Women are not immune to this loss. As men withdraw, women face shrinking pools of potential partners and increasing economic pressure. Many find themselves balancing independence with isolation, freedom with uncertainty. The promise of liberation feels hollow when connection disappears. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it challenges deeply held assumptions about progress. Progress is often defined as breaking away from tradition, but not all traditions are merely constraints. Some are frameworks that enable cooperation. When those frameworks dissolve without replacement, chaos or stagnation follows. Japan attempted to modernize its gender dynamics without fully redefining mutual responsibility. The result was not balance, but fragmentation. Each side pursued autonomy without a shared vision of partnership. Over time, autonomy turned into separation. Attempts to reintroduce family formation through state messaging often fail because they lack authenticity. People can sense when they are being managed rather than understood. Appeals to duty ring hollow when trust has already been broken. Another overlooked factor is the role of shame. Many Japanese men feel shame about their economic position, their social standing, or their perceived inadequacy. Rather than seek validation through relationships that may expose these insecurities, they retreat. Shame thrives in silence, and silence thrives in disengagement. Shame also affects women who face conflicting expectations about independence, career, family, and appearance. When both sides feel judged and misunderstood, connection becomes fragile. The media plays a powerful role in shaping these dynamics. Sensationalized portrayals of gender conflict amplify resentment and discourage empathy. Complex social issues are reduced to simplistic narratives that assign blame rather than encourage understanding. Japan's media landscape has often reinforced stereotypes rather than challenging them. Men are portrayed as either obsolete or irresponsible. Women are portrayed as either demanding or victimized. These caricatures deepen division and discourage cooperation. Education systems also struggle to address these shifts. Young people are taught technical skills, but rarely social resilience or relational literacy. They enter adulthood ill prepared to navigate complex emotional landscapes. When relationships fail, withdrawal feels safer than engagement. Japan's declining population has forced difficult conversations about immigration and automation. While these strategies may alleviate immediate labor shortages, they do not address the underlying relational breakdown. Importing workers does not rebuild trust. Robots do not create families. The long term implications are stark. As the population ages, the burden on remaining workers intensifies. Taxes rise, and services strain. Younger generations face heavier responsibility with fewer rewards. This discourages them from starting families, perpetuating the cycle. Japan is now confronting scenarios that were once theoretical. Who will care for the elderly when there are not enough young people? Who will maintain infrastructure when communities shrink? Who will fund public systems when the tax base contracts? These questions have no easy answers. They are the result of decades of accumulated disengagement, and once the momentum builds, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. The most sobering aspect is that many men believe their withdrawal will not be noticed or missed. They see themselves as interchangeable or irrelevant. This belief, whether true or not, undermines motivation. Why invest in a system that does not seem to care whether you participate? Societies that thrive do not rely on coercion, they rely on voluntary cooperation. When cooperation disappears, no amount of policy can replace it. Japan's experience illustrates this principle vividly. As these patterns spread globally, the urgency of addressing male disengagement grows. Ignoring it does not make it go away. Dismissing it as immaturity or entitlement only deepens resentment. The path forward requires uncomfortable honesty. It requires acknowledging that men's experiences matter, not at the expense of women, but alongside them. It requires rebuilding narratives that emphasize partnership rather than competition. Japan's story is still unfolding. The outcome is not predetermined, but the trajectory is clear. Without meaningful cultural repair, decline will continue. And cultural repair cannot occur without mutual recognition and respect. Once men have fully disengaged, calling them back becomes one of the hardest tasks any society can face. This is because disengagement is not impulsive, it is cumulative. It forms after years of small disappointments, unmet expectations, and internal calculations that quietly conclude participation is no longer worth the cost. When that conclusion settles in, it hardens. Appeals made after the fact often arrive too late. One of the most misunderstood aspects of male withdrawal is that it is not driven by hatred or resentment alone. In many cases, it is driven by exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, psychological exhaustion. the fatigue that comes from feeling constantly evaluated but rarely appreciated. When people reach that state, they do not want arguments, they want peace. And peace to them looks like distance. Why Japan illustrates this clearly. Men who have stepped away do not describe themselves as rebels. They describe themselves as relieved. Relieved to no longer chase approval. Relieved to no longer navigate expectations they feel they can never meet. Relieved to shrink their lives to something manageable, predictable, and quiet. From the outside, this looks like apathy. From the inside, it feels like survival. This is why moral pressure fails. Telling men they have a duty to society, to women, or to the future does not resonate when they believe society has already decided they are unnecessary. Duty only motivates when people feel valued. Obligation without appreciation breeds resentment or withdrawal, not engagement. In Japan, public campaigns encouraging marriage and childbirth often lean on responsibility to the nation. But nations are abstract. People build families for personal reasons, not slogans. They do it because relationships feel meaningful, safe, and mutually rewarding. When those elements are missing, national appeals feel hollow. Another barrier to re engagement is pride. Once men have publicly or privately accepted a solitary path, reversing course requires admitting vulnerability. It requires acknowledging loneliness or regret. In cultures where emotional openness is discouraged, this becomes even harder. Japan's reserved social norms amplify this effect. Many men would rather remain disengaged than risk rejection or humiliation. When past attempts at connection ended in disappointment, the memory lingers. Over time, the fear of repeating that experience outweighs the desire for companionship. There is also the issue of identity. Men who have opted out often build new identities around independence. They redefine success as self sufficiency rather than partnership. They adapt their lifestyles, finances, and expectations accordingly. Asking them to re enter the dating world is not just asking for behavior change, it is asking them to dismantle an identity they worked hard to stabilize. This identity shift is rarely acknowledged in policy discussions. Governments treat disengagement as a temporary phase rather than a settled position. But for many men, it is not temporary, it is a long term adaptation. Japan's attempts to reverse this trend have largely avoided addressing male perspective directly. Conversations focus on increasing opportunities for women or incentivizing families, but rarely on restoring male confidence, dignity, and belonging. This omission matters. You cannot rebuild participation while ignoring half the participants. At the same time, it is important to recognize that re engagement does not mean returning to old models unchanged. Many men do not want a revival of rigid roles. They want clarity, fairness, and reciprocity. They want to know that effort will be met with respect, not suspicion. One of the deepest obstacles is mistrust. Once mistrust sets in between genders, every interaction becomes filtered through doubt. Kindness is questioned. Motives are scrutinized. Small conflicts feel symbolic of larger hostility. This makes connection fragile and short lived. Japan's long period of cultural tension around gender roles has created exactly this environment. Men and women often approach each other defensively, expecting disappointment. When expectations are low, even neutral experiences can feel negative. Media narratives worsen this dynamic. Stories highlighting extreme behaviors or conflicts receive the most attention. Balanced accounts of healthy cooperation are less visible. Over time, people internalize a distorted picture of the opposite gender, making engagement feel risky. Education could play a role in reversing this trend, but only if it addresses emotional and relational skills alongside academics. Young people need frameworks for cooperation, communication, and conflict resolution. Without these tools, relationships feel overwhelming. In Japan, Intense academic and professional pressure leaves little room for emotional development. People enter adulthood highly skilled, but emotionally guarded. When relationships fail, they lack the resilience to try again. Another overlooked factor is the absence of communal spaces. Modern life offers fewer organic opportunities for connection. Work dominates schedules. Social venues are transactional. Digital spaces replace physical ones. When connection requires deliberate effort, many opt out. Japan's urban environment, while efficient, can be isolating. Small apartments, long commutes, and demanding jobs leave little space for social life. Rural areas, once centers of community, are hollowing out. Isolation becomes structural. Economic insecurity compounds all of this. Men who do not feel financially stable hesitate to pursue relationships. Even when expectations have evolved, internalized standards persist. Men judge themselves harshly, often more harshly than others judge them. This internal pressure leads to self exclusion. Men disqualify themselves before others can. They assume rejection and withdraw preemptively. Over time, this becomes habit. Japan's rising homeless population is another symptom of systemic strain. While not directly caused by relationship breakdown, it reflects a society under pressure. When economic systems falter, social bonds weaken, people fall through cracks that widen over time. Some women, facing their own economic struggles, turn to survival strategies that reflect systemic failure rather than moral decline. These realities further complicate gender relations. Trust erodes when desperation rises. The tragedy is that both sides are responding rationally to perceived conditions, yet the collective outcome is destructive. Each individual choice makes sense in isolation. Together, they create decline. This is why blaming men or women individually misses the point. The problem is not personal failure, it is systemic misalignment. Incentives, narratives, and conditions no longer support cooperation. Japan's experience shows that once disengagement reaches a certain scale, momentum takes over. Younger generations grow up observing withdrawal as normal. They internalize caution and skepticism from the start. Re engagement becomes harder with each passing year. This generational effect is crucial. Cultural repair becomes exponentially more difficult when disengagement is inherited rather than discovered. Young men who never see healthy partnership models have little reason to pursue them. Similarly, young women raised in environments where men are absent or disengaged develop expectations shaped by scarcity and disappointment. The cycle perpetuates itself. Breaking the cycle requires more than policy tweaks. It requires cultural humility. It requires acknowledging mistakes without assigning moral superiority. It requires rebuilding narratives that emphasize mutual value. Japan has begun to recognize the severity of its demographic crisis, but recognition alone is not enough. Without addressing male disengagement directly, efforts will remain superficial. The uncomfortable truth is that men will not return simply because they are asked. They will return when conditions change, when respect is restored, when cooperation feels possible, when effort feels meaningful. Until then, withdrawal remains rational from their perspective. And as long as withdrawal remains rational, it will continue. If meaningful re engagement is ever going to happen, it cannot begin with pressure or demands. It has to begin with a change in atmosphere. People do not step back into environments that feel hostile, dismissive, or unsafe. Men who have withdrawn will not respond to calls that frame their return as an obligation or a correction. They will only respond to environments that signal respect, stability, and mutual consideration. One of the most important elements missing in many modern societies is acknowledgement. Not celebration, not praise, but simple acknowledgement that men's experiences are real and that their withdrawal did not occur in a vacuum. In Japan, This acknowledgement has been slow and often reluctant. Discussions tend to focus on outcomes rather than causes. Falling birth rates are treated as technical problems rather than emotional ones. Men need to feel that their presence matters before they are willing to offer it. This sounds simple, but it runs counter to much of the current discourse. When men are told they should participate regardless of how they are treated, participation becomes a burden rather than a choice. Choice is critical. Engagement that feels coerced is unstable and short lived. Re engagement also requires clarity. Ambiguity around roles, expectations, and boundaries creates anxiety. Many men do not know what is expected of them anymore, or whether meeting those expectations will result in appreciation or criticism. When outcomes feel unpredictable, people retreat to minimize risk. Japan's transition away from traditional roles happened faster than its ability to define new ones. Men were told the old models were obsolete, but the replacements were never clearly articulated. This left a vacuum. In that vacuum, men constructed their own definitions of success that excluded relationships altogether. A healthy society offers multiple paths to dignity. When dignity becomes conditional or scarce, competition replaces cooperation. In Japan, dignity became increasingly tied to narrow measures of success that many men felt unable to achieve. Withdrawal became a way to protect self respect. Another necessary condition for re engagement is fairness. Perceived imbalance in effort and reward discourages participation. When men believe they are expected to give more than they receive or to absorb risk without support, they opt out. Fairness does not mean equality in every sense. It means reciprocity. Reciprocity has weakened in many modern relationships. Emotional labor, financial contribution, and responsibility are often framed asymmetrically. Even when expectations are reasonable, perception matters. If men believe the system is stacked against them, they disengage regardless of intent. Trust is the foundation of reciprocity, and trust cannot be rebuilt through slogans. It requires consistent behavior over time. It requires dialogue without accusation. It requires listening without defensiveness. These conditions are rare in polarized environments. Japan's reserved communication style complicates this process. Difficult conversations are often avoided to preserve harmony, but avoidance allows resentment to fester. Without open dialogue, misunderstandings harden into beliefs. Another overlooked factor is mentorship. Young men who see older men thriving in balanced, respectful partnerships are more likely to pursue them. In Japan, such models are increasingly rare. Many older men are themselves disengaged or exhausted. Without visible examples of fulfillment, younger men struggle to imagine a different path. Community structures once provided this guidance. Extended families, neighborhood networks, and shared rituals reinforced cooperation. As these structures weakened, individuals were left to navigate complex social terrain alone. Isolation became normalized. Economic reform alone cannot solve this problem, but it plays a supporting role. Financial stability reduces stress and increases confidence. When men feel perpetually behind, they hesitate to invest emotionally. Policies that improve work life balance, wage growth, and job security can create space for relationships to flourish. However, without cultural repair, economic improvements may not translate into social re engagement. Japan has experienced periods of relative economic improvement without corresponding increases in marriage or birth rates. This suggests that trust, not income, is the binding constraint. Another critical element is narrative repair. Men need to hear stories that include them as contributors rather than obstacles. Women need narratives that portray men as partners rather than liabilities. Media has enormous influence here, yet it often prioritizes conflict over cooperation. Narratives shape expectations. Expectations shape behavior. When expectations are negative, behavior follows suit. Changing narratives does not require denying past problems. It requires expanding the story to include complexity and mutual accountability. Education systems can support this by teaching relational competence alongside academic achievement. Skills like communication, empathy, and conflict resolution are not optional in a healthy society. Without them, people retreat from complexity. Japan's intense focus on performance leaves little room for emotional learning. Failure is stigmatized and vulnerability is discouraged. These norms make relationship building difficult, especially when trust is already fragile. Re engagement also requires patience. Trust lost over decades cannot be restored quickly. Men who have adapted to disengagement will not reverse course overnight. Progress will be gradual and uneven. Expecting immediate results sets the stage for disappointment. This patience must be mutual. Women frustrated by disengaged men are justified in their feelings, but pressure born from frustration often backfires. Re engagement cannot be forced through urgency, it must be cultivated through consistency. One of the most important shifts needed is moving away from adversarial thinking. When gender relations are framed as a zero sum game, cooperation collapses. Gains for one side are seen as losses for the other. This mindset fuels resentment and withdrawal. Japan's experience shows how destructive this framing can be. Men internalized the belief that society had moved on without them. Women internalized the belief that men were unreliable or unnecessary. Both beliefs reinforced each other. Breaking this cycle requires redefining success, not as independence alone, but as interdependence. This does not mean returning to rigid hierarchies. It means recognizing that shared effort creates outcomes no individual can achieve alone. Men who disengaged often did so because they felt replaceable. Restoring a sense of irreplaceability is crucial. People invest when they feel uniquely valued. This applies to relationships, workplaces, and communities. Small changes can signal larger shifts. Genuine curiosity about men's experiences, public acknowledgement of male contributions, balanced discussions that include multiple perspectives. These signals accumulate over time. Japan has begun tentative conversations around these issues, but progress is slow. Cultural inertia is powerful. Admitting mistakes feels risky, yet without honest reflection, stagnation continues. The risk of inaction is not abstract. Each year of disengagement compounds the demographic crisis. Each generation raised within this environment inherits its limitations. The window for meaningful intervention narrows. What makes the situation especially urgent is that disengagement does not announce itself. There are no protests, no demands, just absence. And absence is easy to ignore until it becomes impossible to replace. Men walking away do not do so loudly. They do it quietly. They stop trying. They stop hoping. They stop investing. By the time society notices, the habit is entrenched. Japan stands at a crossroads, but it is not alone. Many societies are approaching similar intersections. The choice is not between progress and tradition, it is between cooperation and fragmentation. Re engagement will require humility from all sides. It will require acknowledging that no group holds a monopoly on suffering or responsibility. It will require rebuilding trust piece by piece. The lesson from Japan is not that decline is inevitable, it is that neglect has consequences. When men feel unvalued, they disengage. When disengagement spreads, societies weaken. If this trajectory continues unchecked, the consequences extend far beyond dating statistics or cultural commentary. They reshape the fundamental structure of a nation. When men disengage at scale, Societies lose more than potential partners or fathers. They lose builders, caretakers, mentors, and stabilizers. Infrastructure does not maintain itself. Communities do not sustain themselves. Care does not happen automatically. All of these require human participation. And when that participation declines, systems begin to fail quietly at first, then visibly, then irreversibly. Japan is already experiencing this slow unraveling. Rural regions hollow out as younger generations migrate or withdraw entirely. Urban centers strain under the weight of an aging population, with too few workers to support it. Healthcare systems face shortages. Elder care becomes a looming crisis rather than a future concern. The question is no longer whether there will be enough people to maintain society, but who will shoulder the burden and for how long. What makes this situation especially stark is that it is not driven by catastrophe. There was no war that erased a generation, no natural disaster that destroyed infrastructure overnight. This decline is the result of millions of individual decisions made quietly, rationally, and independently. That is what makes it so difficult to reverse. There is no single policy failure to correct, no villain to defeat, no dramatic turning point to rally around. There is only accumulation. As the population shrinks, economic growth becomes harder to sustain. Innovation slows when fewer young people enter the workforce. Risk taking declines when survival becomes the priority. Cultural vitality fades when communities lose their generational balance. These effects reinforce one another, creating a downward spiral that policymakers struggle to interrupt. Some argue that technology will solve these problems. Automation will replace labor. Artificial intelligence will increase efficiency. While technology can mitigate certain pressures, it cannot replace human relationships. Machines do not form families. They do not raise children. They do not create social trust. They do not provide emotional continuity. A society built entirely on efficiency without connection becomes brittle. Others point to immigration as a solution. While immigration can help address labor shortages, it does not automatically restore social cohesion. Integration requires trust, shared values, and mutual investment. Without those, new tensions emerge rather than old ones being resolved. Immigration is not a substitute for internal cohesion. It is a complement that only works when the foundation is stable. Japan's experience shows the demographic decline is not just a numbers problem, it is a legitimacy problem. When people stop believing in the future of their society, they stop investing in it. They stop forming families. They stop taking risks. They stop planning beyond themselves. This loss of belief is far more damaging than any economic indicator. Men who have walked away often do not see themselves as abandoning society. They see society as having moved on without them. From their perspective, withdrawal is not betrayal, it is adaptation. And adaptation, once normalized, becomes culture. The most unsettling aspect of the shift is how difficult it is to detect in real time. There are no alarms when disengagement becomes widespread. There is no official announcement when a generation quietly opts out. The signs are subtle: lower participation, less initiative, fewer children, less noise, less urgency. By the time the consequences become undeniable, the causes are deeply entrenched. This is why Japan's situation matters far beyond its borders. It demonstrates what happens when social bonds weaken and are not repaired. It shows that prosperity alone does not guarantee continuity. It reveals that respect and belonging are not optional luxuries, they are structural necessities. The lesson here is not that men must be compelled to return or that women must be blamed for decline. The lesson is that cooperation cannot survive without mutual regard. Societies that thrive do so because people believe their effort matters and their presence is valued. When that belief erodes, participation follows. Rebuilding from this point is possible, but it requires a shift in mindset. It requires moving away from narratives that frame gender relations as a contest and toward narratives that emphasize shared responsibility. It requires acknowledging that progress without balance creates instability. It requires humility from institutions and individuals alike. Men who have disengaged will not return because they are told to. They will return when conditions change, when respect is visible, when expectations are fair, when effort is reciprocated, when trust is rebuilt slowly and consistently. Women, too, deserve honesty about the long term consequences of fragmentation. Independence without connection leads to isolation. Autonomy without cooperation leads to fragility. Strength is not diminished by partnership, it is amplified by it. Japan stands as a living case study of what happens when these truths are ignored. Its empty towns, aging population, and shrinking workforce are not accidents, they are outcomes. And outcomes always have causes. This does not mean the future is fixed. Cultural trajectories can change, trust can be rebuilt, cooperation can be restored, but it cannot happen through denial or blame. It must begin with recognition. Recognition that men matter, recognition that women matter, recognition that societies require both to function, recognition that disengagement is a signal, not a flaw. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this: when men walk away, they are not declaring victory or defeat. They are responding to an environment that no longer feels livable. Ignoring that response does not make it disappear. It only ensures the consequences deepen, and Japan's decline did not begin with malice. It began with misunderstanding, with silence, with assumptions left unchallenged, with grievances left unaddressed, with trust left to erode. Other societies still have time to learn from this, still have time to course correct, still have time to rebuild cooperation before absence becomes permanence. That requires listening rather than lecturing, understanding rather than dismissing, repairing rather than managing. It requires recognizing that men walking away is not a threat. It is a warning. And warnings, when taken seriously, can change outcomes. And so now I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with this assessment? Do you see similar patterns emerging where you live? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because these conversations matter, and the future depends on whether people are willing to engage with uncomfortable realities honestly. Like the video, if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.